like to call the meeting of the committee as a whole meeting for Business Affairs and Administrative. Do you need him to sign something? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. Anyway, and then underneath there also. One more underneath there. Right there. Get out. I want to put away. Fall from that, that's all.
Ms. Coakley, would you roll call, please? Take off my muffle.
Mr. Green.
Here?
Mrs. Heinz. Mr. Derman. Mr. Loop. Mr. Harrell. Mr. Nation. Mrs. Richardson. Mr. Winkler. Mrs. Drucker. Mr. Bittencourt. Mrs. Lamy. Mr. Hersey. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Kuzan. Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Ms. Coakley. We'll dispense with the pledge and invocation. Would any board members like to recognize visitors? None? Has anybody signed up for 5 minutes? 3 minutes? Okay. Like to entertain a motion for the approval of minutes for the committee as a whole meeting held on July 2nd. Is there a motion? Mr. Derman? Mr. Kuzan seconds. Any comments from the public or from the board? Seeing none, let's vote on that. That motion carries with 12 yeas and no nays, no abstentions. I'd like to shift the agenda around just, if I could, and move item 8, which is Ms. Prevost's report. But more importantly, I don't think we need to keep our bond advisors sitting around through some more entertaining school board meetings. I think we can probably get them on. So item A is to consider and take action with respect to adopting a resolution providing for the issuance and sale of taxable general obligation school refunding bonds, Series 2020A of St. Tammany Parish Wide School District Number 12 of the Parish of St. Tammany, State of Louisiana, and providing for other matters in connection therewith. And I'd like to recognize Mr. Grant Schluter and Ms. Stephanie Ferry for an update on that.
Well, we have great news for you, and I think you've seen some of the preliminary figures, but we did bring out to the school board another refinancing, potential refinancing on a taxable basis, because we can't do these advance refundings now on a tax-exempt basis because of federal law. But taxable interest rates have fallen so much, this was a good candidate to refinance the Series 2013 bonds. And accordingly, this board gave preliminary approval. We went to the bond commission. The bonds were priced, and Stephanie's going to give you some of the details on that. But we also did provide information to Standard & Poor's. Terry presented a large quantity of information on the finances of the school board and other matters. And you have a copy of the rating report that was issued by Standard & Poor's, and I'll just mention a few things that are reflected in that report. It's one of the best Standard & Poor's reports I've seen for any political subdivision in Louisiana. They note a very strong fund balance trend over the years by this school board. They note conservative budgeting practices by this school board. Good financial management practices by the school board, particularly the finance department, and low debt burden to the taxpayers. It's an excellent report. I urge you to read it in detail when you have the opportunity to do so, but it's a fine credit report for the school board. So, as far as the refunding, the net savings that'll be that Stephanie will discuss with you are significantly higher than what was presented to you initially when you approved this financing. The net savings to taxpayers, $780,000 over the remaining life of the issue. The percentage savings, present value savings, 6.95%. Bond commission requirements are 3%, so you more than doubled the state bond commission requirement for refinancings of this type. The interest rate on the Series 2013 bonds ranged up to 4.375%. Your true interest cost was 1.69%, and that's on a taxable basis, not a tax-exempt basis. So you also have an updated savings report on all the refinancings the school board has undertaken since 2004. You refinanced 12 individual bond issues, and the savings to taxpayers is in excess of $13 million. And the underwriter, Stephanie Ferry with Raymond James, they did a fantastic job marketing this issue, and you might have some comments.
No, I think Grant hit all the highlights of it, but just to say that the bonds that you did sell had maturities that ranged from 1 year out to 13 years, and the interest rate that those bonds bear ranged from 50 basis points or 0.5% up to just over 2%. So incredibly low interest rates, again, on a taxable basis.
And Mr. Javier signed the bond purchase agreement locking in these savings.
Wonderful, that's great news. I'd like to entertain a motion for this consideration.
So moved.
Mr. Nation, do you have a second? Mr. Harrell seconds that motion, and open it up for comments from the public, and then now from the board. Mr. Bro?
Yeah, that's fantastic news.
It is.
I'm just curious, why are these taxable? You said federal law. Is it because it's a refinancing of an existing loan? So the original people bought it and it was tax-free, but when you refinance it, it's taxable.
Now it has to be taxable unless you refinance within 3 months of when you can first call those bonds for early redemption.
Which is
That's
years
a
away.
change. That's a change in federal law. Most of your prior refundings over the years, going back to 2004, were tax-exempt refundings because there was no limit on how early you could refinance those, and you could do them on a tax-exempt basis. Congress closed that down with the Tax Reform Act, and you could no longer do what we call an advance refunding. You had to wait till the actual date when those bonds could be called. However, taxable rates have gone so low that it now is feasible to do taxable refinancing,
It might
at
hurt
least
us.
now.
It might hurt us in the future, but for right now, 0.5%? Come on.
It's pretty incredible, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other, Mr. Derman?
Thank you, Mr. Green. Grant, just out of curiosity, when we're talking about refinancing these bonds, we're really not changing the duration of the payments. We're just changing the interest rates that is being charged on the outstanding balance.
That is correct. In order to refinance bonds of this type in Louisiana without going back to the voters for authorization for the refinancing, we do not extend the maturity of the bonds, and we reduce the principal and interest requirements each and every year while the bonds are outstanding. So no extension and a reduction each year in the payment on the bonds.
And this is in part the reason why we're able to go out for other bond issues, because it frees up our financing or our funding capability to extend out even further into another bond issue because we have reduced our net outlay.
It's not the exclusive reason, but it is a significant factor. And those numerous refinancings have assisted you in doing exactly what you've indicated, and that is go out every 4 or 5 years to the voters with a request that they consider additional bonds for construction, security, technology, with no increase in the tax rate they're paying on those bonds. And in fact, you've been able to reduce that millage at the same time. So not only have you not increased the bond millage, you have steadily reduced it. And I think I indicated before, I can recall a couple of decades ago that that bond millage was a little under 30 mils, and now it's substantially less than that. So you've come down periodically over the years, at the same time providing sufficient funds for your capital building program, also security and technology.
I appreciate that information. I think it's, it's very important that as a body that we are as a school board, that we are good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars by yet still providing the necessary buildings and construction that's needed for our students and our employees, but having that good balance. And I think, since I've been on the board, I know we have lowered the mills 20 some odd mills, I believe. So, I mean, that's a big impact to, our local taxpayers. And, but it's a partnership because they keep approving them, and, it's up to us to make sure we're using it correctly and wisely. And if we can save them almost $800,000 just in a refinance, then that's what we need to do. And I appreciate y'all's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you, and you make it easy for us. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other comments? We have a motion on the floor to accept this resolution. Let's please go ahead and vote. That motion carries with 12 yeas, 0 nays. Thanks, Grant. Thanks,
Thank you.
Stephanie. Y'all have safe travels home. So we'll move back on agenda here to item A, consideration of a new school board policy file JCEA, sexually related student conduct. Mr. Kosay.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Board, Mr. Jabbia. I have several considerations with policy information tonight, so I have a little, precursor to those once we get to those, and I know we have the first one up. We have several considerations, with the majority of those stemming from recent changes to Title IX in accordance with federal law, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program and activity that receives federal funding. Forethought has provided us with guidance in order to effectuate the necessary policy changes. The changes to Title IX take effect on August the 14th of 2020. So we are seeking passage of these policies in order to be in compliance therewith. So this first one we have it listed as a new school board policy file, JCEA, sexually related student misconduct. Discovery revealed that this is not a new policy, but an existing policy needing revisions, which includes the new title originally titled Student Sexual Harassment. It provides guidance for sexual misconduct, including students. It applies to sexual misconduct that does not rise to the level of harassment as defined by Title IX. So before you, you have the old policy, you have Forethought's proposed changes, and the final that we're asking you to take action on.
Do I have a motion? Ms. Hines? Oh, do I have a second? Sorry, Ms. Lamy. Discussion from the public, from the board. Mr. Brown.
I didn't look at the final policy, but I'm looking at the one with the changes.
Yes, sir.
And if you look at the first paragraph, I was concerned about the wording. And when you just stated the policy, you said that does not rise to the level of harassment as defined by Title IX. But in the change that I have, and a copy I have, it says does not rise to the level of sexual misconduct. So basically, the way it's read is you're explaining what sexual misconduct is, and then you say it's sexual misconduct, but does not rise to the level of sexual misconduct. So is it harassment or is it sexual misconduct? Because it doesn't make sense the way it's written.
I'm looking, what line are you on, Mr.
It's
Bro?
under the blue, but you have to read it from like, it refers, or actually say sexual misconduct does not refer to occasional compliments of social acceptable nature.
Yes, sir.
And then it goes on to say what it is. You're defining sexual misconduct, and then comma, but does not rise to the level of sexual misconduct. And when you stated it just before this, you said does not rise to the level of sexual harassment. So which is it?
That may be something I need to address. So it appears that there may have been an oversight on my part that needed to have a correction there. And the whole situation that's happening here is that, and the reason for all, it may help just to elaborate on the explanation of what is prompting these changes in policy. The changes to the law under Title IX have specified sexual harassment within the context of that particular federal law. And so these policies basically are an attempt to sort of delineate what constitutes a claim or sexual harassment, which equals sexual discrimination now within the context of Title IX. There's also some language in these policies that sort of delineates the nature of sexual harassment for purposes of Title VII. And this particular policy, it's intended to address sexual misconduct that involves students that does not necessarily rise to the level of what's considered sexual harassment. And so there may be a misnomer in here, as Mr. Bro has pointed out, and that would be an error on my part, that we would need to basically just amend and have the correct wording for harassment versus misconduct. So, and I can do that and have that basically remedied.
That was my only comment. So if we make that change, then support the motion.
And we still have a policy for sexual harassment. There's a sexual harassment, and then this is now, we've kind of changed the sexual harassment to match the language in Title IX for sexual misconduct.
Correct, and our steps are not going to change with how we've dealt with that, but we have to align with the new law, with the new federal law.
And what these do really is just to sort of carve out the Title IX information and changes is handled a little bit differently. And so this change in policy is just meant basically to sort of delineate the different types of it's all sexual harassment except within the context of each particular federal law. Basically it's defined a little bit differently and handled a little bit differently. So the purpose of these changes to the policies is to better delineate that and set it out sort of on a more individual basis.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the board? Mr. Derman?
Thank you. I guess my question is regarding the motion that's on the floor. Is it, and Mr. Bro was pointing out the second policy with the blue and the red highlights in it, and then we're actually voting to approve the final policy. Is that not correct?
No,
It is, but the wording is,
I understand the wording, but
Yes,
I'm
sir.
just saying which policy that we're actually making a motion to approve,
we're asking you to approve the final.
the final draft.
Correct.
Down here with the correction that Mr. Bro has mentioned, but not in the other, because one says new, old,
We're
and
going to take
final.
each item separately.
But the recommended action doesn't say the final in here, so I just want to make that clear.
Mr. Derman, our normal process is to give to you the original policy that we had. We take forethoughts, we mock it up, do what we need to do to make any changes, and then we present a final. So out of this packet, The last one that says draft is what we're asking you to approve with Mr. Bro's amendment to change that one word, and we'll get that changed for next time.
And I understand that, Mr. Jabby, but what I'm saying, when you read the recommended actions on our computer screen, it says acceptance of the new school board policy.
Well, this will be the new school board policy.
I'm just saying it should say the final policy.
It'd be the new final policy.
Because we got so many other policies right here, I'm just saying it
It's the
should be.
final new policy or the new final
policy,
policy?
but
How do you
final
say
needs
that?
to be in there.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Kuzan.
Thank you. So we would consider a sexual misconduct as a minor infraction and a sexual harassment as a major infraction? To distinguish between the two?
Well,
Well, no, I mean, if it's, our protocol that we have in place right now is if we have a student-to-student behavior by our students, whether it be sexual misconduct or sexual harassment, that could be handled on the campus by the principal. And it depends on what level of that behavior that they violated. How severe was it? Or has it been something that has happened before? What is the kid's record that the appropriate action would be taken on that student?
Okay.
Does seem like the misconduct is the lesser offense, though.
And whether it's sexual misconduct or sexual harassment. And not to disagree, but you could have some pretty severe sexual misconduct cases as well.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Fair enough. We have a motion on the floor. Any other comments? Let's go ahead and vote. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Next item is consideration of new school board policy file JAAA, Title IX, Sexual Harassment. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Item B, again, we're asking you to consider this is a new school board policy, file JAAA, Title IX, Sexual Harassment. You have before you the forethought, and then you have the final new that we're asking you to adopt. This particular policy provides important definitions as contained in Title IX, including the definition of sexual harassment as set forth in Title IX, which is very narrow and specific. It provides for designation of a Title IX coordinator and the manner in which complaints pursuant to Title IX are to be reported, investigated, and handled.
Thank you, Mr. Kosei. Do I have a motion? Ms. Hines, second by Mr. Derman. Any comments from the public? Mr. Broom. Please state your name and where you're from. Not like we don't know.
Thank you. My name is Robert Broom from Slidell, and I do have a comment on this second of this school board policy, JAAA. And I was originally going to make some comments about my comments about the English wording of some of these descriptions in here. The definition, the second line of the definition, I think the English is a little strange, and maybe it could be improved. And then there's something about the formal complaint that is confusing to me. Those were just minor issues. It was something I wanted to bring up. But the reason I actually am taking your time is I was going to send those minor issues straight into the school board to Mr. Kosei so that, he could look at them in advance. and it didn't work. The following addresses had permanent fatal errors, reason 554, rejecting banned content. And that actually is a significant issue. The school, and I believe, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in this, believe that the school board mail filters caught my email because I put the title in here on sexual harassment. I used the banned word of sex in the email. That's to protect our teachers and stuff. The reason I bring it up is that could actually be a real problem for a faculty member or a student or a parent who wishes to inform the school board or make a complaint to the appropriate officials in the school board, as the policy allows, via email. Right now, you guys never get it because it would be rejected by the school computer systems. So I think that needs to be investigated a little bit, make sure that that problem doesn't exist or is fixed, so that our filters don't prevent people from making the necessary comments to the school board when these serious issues come up. So I'm raising that as an issue, and I'm sure that the administration can address it as appropriate, but it was a bit of a surprise to me that I couldn't get through to you guys on this particular issue. I wasn't sure whether the internal systems were a little bit more permissive and you guys hadn't seen it on the internal computer systems, but it certainly is a problem for people coming in from the outside. So I will leave my English comments with Mr. Kosei the old-fashioned way, and he can deal with those as he seems appropriate. But thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Broom. We'll look into that filter, Mr. Any comments from the board? If not, we have a motion. Let's go ahead and vote. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item C, consideration of revisions to school board policy file GAMC investigations. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Green. On item C, we're asking you to consider the revisions to school board policy file GAMC investigations. This adds language to carve out the process for investigating complaints under Title IX, which will be handled, that will be handled separately. You have the old policy before you, you have the forethought with changes, and you have the final, which we're asking you to adopt.
Thank you. Do I have a motion? Ms. Lamey? Ms. Hines, second. Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Great, let's vote. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed you, Mr. Bro.
Okay, my only comment was, specifically, we added the no school board member shall participate in any investigation. I'm not asking to participate. I don't want any part of these, but I'm just wondering why that was added in. Is that because we are an authority that may have appeal, or I'm just wondering, curiosity.
That was already actually,
It was just in a different place.
yeah, that was just sort of a cleanup on the language, as far as that goes. Really, the only change to the policy essentially would just be to add the language
Title IX.
to carve out the Title IX investigation
Right.
process.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Let's vote, please. And that motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item D, consideration of revisions to school board policy file GAEAA, sexual harassment. Mr. Kosei.
Next up, Mr. Green, is we're asking the board's consideration for, again, the revisions to school board policy file GAEAA, sexual harassment, which addresses sexual harassment under Title VII. And before you, you have the old policy, the forethought changes, as well as the final for adoption.
Do I have a motion? Mr. Derman, do I have a second? Mr. Kuzan? Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Seeing none, let's vote. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item E, consideration of revisions to School Board Policy File GAE, the grievance procedure. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Again, item E, consideration of those revisions to School Board Policy File GAE, the grievance procedure. This revised policy file, our steps have not changed. Just want to make that clear. This simply adds for the provision of the grievance procedures in accordance with Title IX. You have before you the old policy, the forethought changes, as well as the final we're asking you to adopt.
Thank you, Mr. Kosei. Do I have a motion? Ms. Page, do I have a second? Ms. Lamey? Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Seeing none, let's vote. Motion carries 12 yea, 0 nay. Item F, consideration of revisions to School Board Policy File GAAA, Equal Opportunity Employment. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Another of our policies in line with what we're dealing with tonight. Item F, consideration of revision of School Board Policy File GAAA, Equal Opportunity Employment. This adds some cleanup language to align with Title IX. You have before you the old policy, the forethought changes, as well as the final we're asking you to adopt.
Do I have a motion? Ms. Hines, do I have a second? Ms. Page? Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Seeing none, let's please vote. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item G, consideration of revisions to School Board Policy File CG, Administrative Records. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Our final agenda item with policies tonight is asking you to consider the revisions to School Board Policy File CG, Administrative Records. This was actually previously approved at a committee as a whole meeting. And you asked us to take it back, and we looked at amending that policy. So before you, you have those three items. You have the one that was previously approved at the committee as a whole, policy with changes, and we're asking you to adopt the final with changes tonight. This information was reviewed by Mr. Bob Hammonds, Mr. Danny Garrett, as well as our legal counsel, Ms. Jana Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Kosei, and I so move. Do I have a second? Mr. Nation? Any comments from the public? None. Any comments from the board? Ms. Richardson?
Could you clarify which committee as a whole meeting this policy was approved or suggested for recommendation, please?
June?
I believe I was absent that day, and the only reason I ask is because what's posted on our actual school board page is different, and so I've been just trying to identify the differences here.
Ms. Richardson, it was never approved by the board. It was approved at the committee as a whole to go to the board, but it was pulled before the board voted on the adopting the policy. We took it back, and we're just now bringing that back to you. So it's never been approved by the full board. The only thing that should be on our website should be our old policy.
It is, and unfortunately, I had looked at the two documents, and I just see that there's literally one phrase at the top, taken out budget worksheet, and then at the towards the bottom, there's a bullet point that was removed. But then, like I said, I don't know, I just thought to go to the website and just let me look at the original policy so I can kind of see where we're going. I mean, can you just speak to perhaps, I mean, because that policy is definitely different than what's in front of us. Can you speak to those changes so that, just for the sake of public record, what are the changes from what's actually current on the board
Well,
website?
We're asking you on the first,
That's not what she's asking.
oh, I'm sorry.
She's asking from the original policy.
Right.
Let me turn on my mic.
Yes, sir.
You're asking what's posted on the website now as our original policy. What's different than,
Right.
what's
'cause
different here?
I
than
can
what's
see the
on-
red
what's our
line easy
original?
enough from I guess, the recent one from the June meeting. But like I said, I just kind of thought, let me pull up what the current policy is. And there are some significant differences, but could you just speak to those, please? Because I think it's important we identify those.
Do you have the one, Jana?
I do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Would you go ahead and review the changes that was presented at the committee as a whole,
Yes.
June 6th? I mean, the June committee as a whole, whatever that date that was.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So, at the committee as a whole meeting back in June, the original policy was presented, and a number of amendments at that time had been approved by the board. There is a section in the top that added some language about normal business hours for the school board office. There's a large amount of language that was changed in the original portion. Some of it is very much just cleanup language. There's a sentence that states that each official or employee holding school system records should endeavor to segregate privileged and confidential records from public records to the extent practical. There was a change in the language that basically struck out some of the old language regarding a school board member reviewing records, basically.
Right.
That
I think that's where I'm honing in on, because I've even highlighted it for my eyes, because this is what, it just didn't look the same size document, and I just was like, wait a minute. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to read the paragraph I have an issue with, and it's right above disclosure of privileged or confidential information. And it basically reads, an individual school board member shall have the same authority as afforded to a member of the general public to review school system records. However, the school board, upon majority vote of the total school board membership, shall have the right to examine any and all records of the school system, but shall maintain the confidentiality of any records which are not otherwise public records. That makes
Yes.
sense to me, that we must maintain confidentiality. But that paragraph just doesn't sit right, only because it sounds like you are giving board members the same rights as the public. However, if you go to the LSBA and where they identify specific laws regarding a school board member's access to public records, I want to read specifically, it's in bold, and it's the law. It says LRS 44:1 sets forth the extensive general statement as to what the public record includes for a school board member. And it says, and this is in bold, the word all. All books, records, writings, account letters, and letter books, maps, drawings, photographs, cards, tapes, recordings, memographs, papers, and all copies, duplicates. The list just goes on. And then it says in bold, regardless of physical form or characteristic. And so I'm trying to understand where we're going here.
this would be my take on it. I think that this particular policy was originally drafted and essentially still remains to be in line with revised statute 1781, which basically provides that a school board member does have access to review records which are not confidential or privileged in any form or fashion. And that is not affected or changed by this at all. There is some difference in the language. However, the individual school board member doesn't lose any authority to review any records that are not otherwise confidential or exempted or some sort of exception for that. And if there is an interest or desire to review a record that is subject to some sort of confidentiality or privilege, then that is when the majority vote is required.
Where did that come from? Because it's not even suggested in any of these. If you look at the Louisiana School Boards Association handbook that's attached directly to laws, why would we require a school board a vote to look at records?
The vote is required for records that are confidential or subject to some sort of privilege. That's plainly set forth in Title 17. 1781 is the statute that's entitled Powers and Duties of School Boards. And that, if you look at Section K1 of that statute, it specifically identifies an individual school board member's ability to access and review records, examine records, basically. And those
Does
are
it say we have to have a majority vote to do that?
not
Because I don't think that's what it says.
not for all records. No, that's not what it says. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have the right to examine records of the school system, except specific records that are identified in the statute that are subject to some sort of privilege, confidentiality, or something of that nature. Those are the records that, in order to examine, you would have to have a vote.
Okay, so, and let me just express before my fellow board members my concern here. When we were elected to this position, we are obviously placed this huge, enormous responsibility of general oversight of the school board, and of course, we're a policy-driven board. We're responsible for hiring the superintendent, but our duties are to be able to have access to records. It's going to be a little bit different than that of what the public would be requesting, and I certainly understand that confidential records such as social security, numbers and things that I shouldn't see. I don't want to see, first of all, and secondly, we were bound by Louisiana Board of Ethics to maintain confidentiality of said records. So I'm just trying to understand, because every single board member, right, on this, out of all 15 of us, we all have skill sets and strengths and weaknesses that we bring to this table. And what I'm going to be interested in seeing versus somebody else may not be of interest to them. So I'm not confident that a board member would be successful in always obtaining a majority vote on records that I'm confident that you can block out confidential data that's excluded under the law, but I don't understand why a majority vote's needed when, honestly, we've seen it time and time again, this board doesn't always agree. And we have a great board. But I'm just saying, we don't always agree. So I'm trying to understand where we're going here and why that was put in there.
This is what I would offer. I don't think that in terms of substantive, from a substantive perspective, that it really it changes anything between this and the previous policy language, which, by the way, was, I believe, word for word in accordance with revised statute 1781.
Okay.
I think all it does is sort of shorten that, basically. It doesn't change or alter an individual school board member's ability to examine records as set forth in 1781 K1.
I'm sorry?
I think,
Yeah, I'm pulling it up now. Well, I'm going to obviously do some more work on that. It's just I take my job very seriously, as do I trust my colleagues, and I'm not comfortable with the current wording of this policy because I have an obligation to uphold, and I just feel unless you have something to offer that would put my mind at ease, I'm not comfortable with this policy as is. Thank you.
Mr. Nation.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Kosei, who does Mr. Garrett work for?
School board's attorney.
School Board Association Attorney.
Mr. Garrett works for the Louisiana School Board Association. He reviewed this?
That's correct.
And Mr. Hammonds, he's, of course, has his own law firm, but he does a lot of work for LSBA too, doesn't he?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so two respected attorneys, and one that works for the LSBA reviewed this policy, and they found no issues with it, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. Bro?
Yes, didn't Mr. Garrett propose the original one, which we are now readdressing because it had numerous problems with it? Well, several
No.
problems with it.
No, in fact,
Two things.
Walked out.
in fact,
It had policy changes from the original.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I
No, you got the.
have the floor.
Yes.
All right, so here's what you said, that basically we don't change anything substantially from the original wording. I proposed last time that we keep the original wording. It is more clear, and it's directly related to the Louisiana state law. I was rejected my motion was rejected. I strongly feel that this limits the board members, or at least it reads that it limits the board members' access to records. It says specifically that we should only be able to get records if, one, we apply for it through the public, as any other public, or we go through a school board vote to get those records. The original wording was much clearer and more substantial than this wording, and as you said, you don't see any substantial difference, but I do, and so I would prefer to put the original wording back in. No school board, I challenge you to find any school board that would give up its authority as this thing is worded. There are none in the state. And we are just eliminating our duty here if we accept this.
should I respond?
Can you address any district that has wording like this?
I cannot provide you with any other district's policy on this specific issue. With regard to whatever the comments that you had made initially, I would like to point out to you that Mr. Garrett did not oppose the language that was originally proposed when this policy was presented to the committee as a whole meeting back in June. In fact, Mr. Garrett was the person who drafted the changes to this language. So, and this, I think there were many issues concerning this portion of the proposed changes to the policy that were discussed and raised at the June meeting, committee as a whole meeting. So,
So to be clear, Mr. Garrett proposed changes to this paragraph as such?
that's correct.
Mr. Kuzan.
Thank you. What if a school board member wants to abstain on a particular vote with reference to records? This allows you, as a member, to abstain if you don't want to be involved in that particular vote. If there's no vote, then it's saying that the whole board agrees with what you're doing. So as a board member, I can abstain for something she presents if I want to. But if there's not a vote, then you don't have that authority. Do I make any sense?
I'm not sure.
Huh?
I'm not sure what you're saying.
I'm saying if we have a vote, a majority vote, and on that vote, if you still get a majority, the board's still gonna do that, but as a single board member, you may wish to abstain from that particular vote. And that gives you the option to do that. Or you wanna vote no on that request. That gives you the right. That's all.
If I may try to just identify a couple of issues here. I hear what Shelton, Ms. Richardson, Mr. Bro are saying. I'm wondering if it would alleviate the issue is that an individual school board member shall have the same authority as afforded member to general public. If we tie that to the expense of producing these records, so if you're a school board member and you want all these documents, you have the same pricing grid, if you will, if it applies, okay? And then, but it doesn't limit our ability to access records to any degree. That would circumvent someone's ability to access documents without going through that grid through a school board member. So the same rules would apply, but it wouldn't limit one school board's member's ability to access those. Does that make sense? Does that help identify some of the issues here? Mr. Nation.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mr. Green. I think that, I hear what you're saying, and it makes total sense what you're saying to me. Again, I don't see the issue, but I mean, I guess we all read things differently. I mean, because it just says we have the right to review records. So, I mean, for the general public, to me, makes it even more transparent. So, I mean, if we're all about transparency, as some of the board members, talk about a lot, if we have to go through the public records request, then that's transparent. That's on the record that Michael Nation is asking for X record, just like the public. So it lets the board know, it lets the public know what we're looking at. So otherwise, right now, it's secret. I mean, I can go pull a record, and so to me, it makes it more transparent, as to what board members are.
Can you clarify what, I'm sorry, can you clarify?
But I like your idea about tying it to the copies, because that's the.
Well, and I'm just curious, what,
Just 1 second, just 1 second.
yeah,
I can't get back into the documents section because the voting is up. Can you take that off so we can get back and look at it, please? Thank you, I'm sorry.
yep, no problem. I was just curious, what kind of documents, so like the first sentence reads, an individual school board member shall have the same authority to review school records, and then the second says, shall have the right to we'll need this majority vote. What delineates, what kind of documents are we talking about? Because the first sentence says a school board has the rights like any public person to come in and pretty much has access to everything within reason. So what kind of documents are we talking about?
Right, it would be,
Emails, personnel records.
essentially, the things that the board is not entitled to review or examine or have access to without a majority vote would be evaluations, observations, formal complaints, basically employee records, grievances. Those would be the nature of the documents that would require a majority vote.
And right now, we would have access to those? Under the policy that is written today, we would have access to those without a majority vote?
No.
So what are we talking about
The
here?
ones that she just brought up, you were
Semantics.
asking what you did not have access to. You would have to have, that's where you would have to have the vote.
But today, we do or don't have access to those?
You do
don't-
not.
You do not.
Okay.
And that's what I was explaining earlier, is that in terms of like substantive nature, there's really not a big substantive nature here. It's really just a change in the language, a change in semantics. It shortens the policy. I think it really is an attempt to just make it more clear, but it still tracks the language of revised statute 1781 in terms of what the individual board members have the right to examine.
Okay, Mr. Bro, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this does not substantially change the process, but I think the wording sounds like it's much more restrictive because it says that we only have the original wording spelled out that we had authority to look at records, but now we're limiting to, with the first sentence, saying that only public records. The part where, in the original one, again, I wish I had the original in front of me, but in the original one, it did say that to get access to confidential records, those that are, employee grievances, whatever, those still require the vote of the board. So by changing the wording in that paragraph to say that only public, we have the rights of a public, then we have lost that ability to go in and take and look at records. When I first came on as a board member, I spent 2 to 3 hours with Ms. Prevost over there going through all the financial records. And I found, she showed me pots of money that I had no idea we had. As a school board member, I appreciate that. As Title A, my duty is the oversight. I need to know in order to set policy. I need to know in order to establish, to vote on a budget. I need to know for all my duties as a school board member to be able to access those records and not to go through a public request to get them. Mr. Betancourt said the same thing at the last meeting when this thing came up. He said, the school system has always been cooperative. When you go in there, you get what you want, and you can examine whatever your records, and they come through for you. Now, with the wording here, we are abolishing that policy. At some point, they could say, oh, well, you only have the same authority as any other member of the public. Therefore, you have to go put a public request in to get that information. I know that's not the intent. You've told me that's not the intent, but reading this, that's the intent I get. The original wording was much better than this, and I cannot accept the way this is because it's misleading.
We understand that this is the right to examine, and this is not copies. That's what this is about. You can get any record you want to examine, anyone you want to examine. We're talking about copies.
There's nothing about copies in that paragraph.
It says examine. Does it not? You have the right to examine any and all records.
Review school system records, but only as a member of a general public to review the school system records.
You review school system records, that's examine.
Right.
Review.
We only have the authority as same as the general public to review. Now,
That's all we have now.
if Joe Q. Public came in to Ms. Provost and said, I want to look at all your financial records, would she allow them to do that?
Yes, sir. That's a public records request. That's a public records law. They have the right to review and examine. If they want copies, then they will pay the price that is set out in the policy.
You might get a cup of coffee though, Mr. Bro.
You understand what I'm saying, Mr. Bro?
I hear what you're saying,
This
but
has
it
nothing to
sounds
do
like
with-
it limits the authority of the school board members to examine records or to
really does
review records. It diminishes our ability to that of the general public. That's just the way I read it.
You have the same rights as the general public.
And I would think that a school board member would have additional rights to go and examine all records that are not confidential.
And you can.
Well, then the original policy was much clearer on that.
Mr. Betancourt?
Thank you, Mr. Green. This is pretty simple. It's explained in the first paragraph, right under administrative records. We have a right to see, and I don't think we have to put in a public records request to everything y'all were just talking about, Ms. Prevost's records. But I can't come in here tomorrow morning and say, Pete, show me Christie's personnel file. I don't have that authority.
You're not.
Now, the school board, when we're in session, and there's some case that we, as a board, say we want to see Christie's personnel records, and that passes, then we as a board are sitting in,
Correct.
then we can see that record.
Correct.
I can't see it as just an ordinary board member. And that's all that this thing says. We have every right to see anything that we're allowed to see. And we're not gonna have to put in a public records request. We can come in or on the phone, whatever, and get it done. But we've never had the ability to just come in here and say, oh, I'm a board member, I wanna see so-and-so's personnel file. We've never had that privilege.
I would
That's when
suggest
the
that
board
Mr.
has to
Betancourt's
vote on it.
assessment is very
That's-
accurate.
If you read it enough, it kinda jumps out at you. Thank you.
Mr. Derman?
Thank you. I'm just, looking at the three different policies and we looking at the same languages in all three policies.
Well, that's because this is the policy that was brought, I'm sorry. This was the policy that was brought to the committee as a whole, Mr. Derman. This is not our original policy that's on the website right now. We didn't bring that because the committee as a whole had already approved this policy that you have tonight. And with the addition of a couple of things that we've struck out, it's intact for what was presented at the June committee as a whole meeting.
Okay, Pete, on this one right here, I'm looking at adopted April 13th of 2017 and revised December 2019. That's the dates on this particular policy that I'm looking at.
Right.
And the verbiage is exactly the same when you're looking at the individual school board member.
Where are you looking, Mr. Dunn?
If you look at
This
the
is the-
CG administrative records, CG 19,
That's the
then you
old,
look at every one of them.
That is an error that should have been removed because it has not been adopted. It says a draft. That's our error, Mr. Dunn.
I guess he's talking about here.
This is a draft that we're asking you to approve tonight. So it can't be adopted. That was on the original one that should have been removed before bringing to you tonight.
Okay. Because I'm just saying all three policies got the same verbiage as it relates to individual school board member,
Yeah.
from what I can see.
Yes, sir. That's because none of these are the original policy that's on our website right now.
Those dates on that
So
one,
you're
that first
taking
one
an
you're
amended
looking at,
policy and amending it.
that says administrative records policy is amended, those dates should have been removed at the end.
Okay. All right. But my point, I still understand what Mr. Betcourt's saying about the responsibilities and or the authorities of an individual board member versus the entire board. And where Act One puts our authority and what we have is outside of this boardroom, we are basically individual citizens with the same public rights. You can shake your head, Mr. Brogue, but that's the truth. If we want to do something different and take action as a board, then we have a different set of authorities. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. We have a motion on the floor to accept this consideration. So let's go ahead and move that to a vote. That motion carries 9 yeas, 3 nays. I believe that wraps up those agenda items, but we move to you for the administrative section of our meeting here. So with the monthly maintenance and custodial report, Mr. Kosei.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Green. Your monthly maintenance and custodial report is before you tonight, and we have Mr. Wade Gottschalk present if you have any questions regarding that report.
Any questions from Mr. Gottschalk? No? No? How about the risk management report?
Mr. Kurt Gaspard is here, Board, with your monthly risk management report, if you have any questions before you.
Any questions? No? And the transportation report?
And finally, your monthly transportation report is with you, and we have our transportation director, supervisor, Mr. George Bodie, here to answer any questions you may have relative to that report.
Any questions for Mr. Bodie? No? Mr. Betancourt, did I see you with your hand up? No? You're good? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kosei.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite Ms. Tipton up to run through our construction report.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The first item on the construction portion of the agenda is consideration of bids received on July 28th, 2020. Those were attached in board docs. And we received 8 bids for the additions to Fifth Ward Junior High School. And we're recommending that those be rejected for being over budget. And that is School Board Project number 1930.
Do I have a motion? Mr. Bro, do I have a second? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro has a motion that we reject that consideration. Do I have a second? Mr. Harrell? Thank you, Mr. Harrell. Seconds. Any questions from the board? Yes. He was rejecting the rejection. No. We're accepting the motion to accept the rejection. Thank you for that semantic clarification there. Yes, sir. Mr. Derman.
I know this is the second time around on this, correct?
Yes, sir.
And how much over budget were we?
The budget for this construction is $1,645,000. And we did, with the revisions that were made from the first project that was bid, we brought these bids down around 200,000. But we're still pretty close to 100,000, it looks like, over at this point. So we're going to regroup and make some revisions and get it back out for bid again.
Well, I'm just kind of concerned with what's going on in the construction world right now, that our prices appear to be going up, for materials and whatnot. So, we may be in a vicious cycle here. Every time we go back out and rebid, even though we make cuts and the prices go up, and for material cost, we're right back at the same boat. We're still over budget by, this is what, over budget by 5 to 8%. Mr. Bro, you got your numbers on that?
No, I didn't do the numbers.
We're looking at the base.
I would just like to comment that at some point, Ms. Tipton's going to make a recommendation that we accept the bid, even if it's over. We're going to keep working on it. I think she's, at this point, willing to keep working on it until we get there.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, I was just curious, because, like I'm saying, I just don't want to keep delaying. If it's just every time we delay, costs go up, and we're right back, and then we cut, and then we're back, But if we got a plan, and I'm sure you do, but I'd like to get this project on the road, I guess is what I'm saying.
We absolutely would.
I know Mr. Harrell would
Yes,
too.
sir.
So that's all I got.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Any additional comments on that motion? Can we vote, please? The motion to reject those bids has passed, 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item B.
Yes, sir. We're recommending acceptance of Lyon Elementary School 300-wing roofing as substantially complete, subject to the architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of interim superintendent Javia, STPSB project R0071.
Mr. Derman makes that motion with Ms. Hines seconding. Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Let's vote. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. Item C.
We're recommending acceptance of Mandeville High School site improvements Phase 3 as substantially complete, subject to architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of interim Superintendent Javia STPSB Project P0245.
Thank you. I so move. Is there a second? Mr. Nation, seconds. Any comments from the public? Any from the board? Seeing none, let's vote, please. That motion carries 12 yeas, 0 nays. The construction report, Ms. Tipton.
Yes, sir. At Madisonville Elementary, the contractor is installing sheetrock and hanging ceiling grid support wires. Foundations for the canopy to cross C.S. Owens Road are being installed. Exterior metal panels are also being installed, and permanent power is being established so that the HVAC units can be started up. At Mandeville High, the contractor and subcontractors are completing the work at the locker room addition for final occupancy. The wheelchair lift for the mezzanine access has been installed. The exterior brick delivery was received last week, and the brickwork at the locker room is very near completion. Brickwork is also underway at the classroom building, and the window frames are being installed on that classroom building as well. The contractor has mobilized on site at Salmon High School and has completed the interior demolition work. The new tennis courts for Covington High School are advertised for bids, and this project is to provide new tennis courts to replace the existing tennis courts so that the new classroom building can be located in that area of the campus. And we are expecting to receive these bids next week and bring them to the board meeting on Thursday next week. The contractor is moving utility lines and preparing for foundations for the new buildings for the Abney Early Childhood Center additions, and the land for the new parking lot for the Abney schools has been cleared, and the contractor has started installing subsurface drainage. The walkways are complete for the temporary modular classroom building at Lancaster, and the electrical work and special systems are progressing for that building. We've also got the project for the new 12 classroom addition for Lancaster Elementary School advertised for bids this week. Document production for the capital improvement projects for the new bond issue continues to progress well. Most recently, we've reviewed progress sets of documents for Magnolia Trace additions, North Shore High additions, and Lee Road Junior High additions. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tipton. As always, very busy. Any questions from the board? Thank you again.
Thank you.
Next item on our agenda is the internal auditor monthly report. That report has been made available. Are there any questions for Mr. Incaprera? None? Okay, thank you. We covered one big item on the business affairs, but I'll invite Ms. Prevost up to answer any questions on the monthly financial report.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I just want to point out, this is the June financial statement, so it's the last one of fiscal 20, but it is not final. With the last month of the fiscal year, we have to book revenues and expenses for that fiscal year up until August 31st. So we'll be accruing receivables and payables. Just to make you aware, and one of the big ones, if you look at the financial statements, is we have one more sales tax for last year, which will be about 8 million, hopefully. So that's going to increase those numbers significantly, and we'll receive some more property tax as well next week. Any questions?
Any questions on that report? No. How about the purchasing report?
Ms. Stevens is here to answer any questions on that report.
Any questions for Ms. Stevens? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Prevost. That's all the items on our agenda. I'll turn it over to Mr. Nation, our board president, for any announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We have two announcements tonight. Our board meeting, which is next Thursday night, the 13th, at 7 p.m., is in Slidell at Brooks Educational Complex. And our annual public hearing concerning input for the proposed budgets for fiscal year 2019-2020, is that 2020, 2021, right? Yeah, okay, all right. Fiscal year 2020, 2021 will be held on Thursday, August the 20th at 6 PM. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. With no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord.